I've been hiking the gnarly trails of the Pacific Northwest for the better part of a decade, man. I've seen Mount Rainier in the dead of summer when it looks like a freaking postcard, and I've seen it in the late fall when the weather gets more than a little sketchy. I thought I knew the mountain, but I am telling you, I ain't ever seen anything close to the absolute beast of a storm that swallowed me whole on that Tuesday afternoon. The meteorologist back in Seattle called it a rapidly intensifying cyclonic system. Whatever, man. Nerd talk. Down in the trenches, up on the exposed side of that massive rock, it was just pure, unadulterated hell. I'm talking about a total, devastating whiteout that drops visibility to zero and makes you question every life choice that led you to this exact moment. You know that shocking feeling when you dive into a freezing swimming pool and your lungs just involuntarily seize up? Imagine that exact sensation, but it never stops. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was screaming. It sounded like a massive freight train derailing right next to my ear, a continuous, deafening roar that vibrated straight through my skull. I had top-of-the-line gear, a customized Gore-Tex hard shell, heavy-duty merino base layers, the works. But against this wind, I might as well have been wearing a cheap Halloween costume. The cold bypassed the flesh entirely and sank its icy teeth right into my bones. My buddy Brody was supposed to be waiting down at the lower base camp. We had a strict rule. If the sky turns the color of bruised iron, you bail, no questions asked. I tried to bail, but the storm moved in so fast it was like someone threw a giant icy blanket over the entire mountain range. One minute I was carefully navigating a patch of loose scree, and the next I couldn't even see the tips of my own boots. Every single step became a life or death gamble. The snowdrifts piled up insanely fast, swallowing my legs up to the thighs. I was burning calories at a ridiculous rate just trying to stay upright against the gusts. Hypothermia is a sneaky little bastard. First comes the shivering, the violent shaking that makes your muscles ache. Then, after a while, the shivering just stops. That's when you know you're seriously screwed. Your body throws in the towel. My fingers inside my expedition gloves had gone from painful pins and needles to numb blocks of wood. I tried to wiggle my toes, but there was nothing there. Just a heavy, dead sensation. My brain started playing cruel tricks on me. I started thinking, hey, maybe I should just sit down behind this boulder for a minute, close my eyes for 5 seconds. It felt like such a warm, inviting idea. The blowing snow around me started to look soft, like a massive featherbed begging me to lie down. That was the hypothermia talking. I had to literally slap my own face, feeling the frozen plastic of my goggles smack my cheekbone just to jolt myself awake. I kept repeating a harsh mantra. Keep moving, Jake. Don't be a freaking idiot. Keep moving or you die right here. I knew there was an A-frame emergency shelter somewhere around this elevation. It was built back in the 70s for exactly this kind of worst-case scenario. But finding a small wooden shack in a whiteout is like trying to find a specific grain of salt in a snowstorm. I was navigating purely by the slight incline beneath my feet and blind, stupid luck. I don't know how much longer I wandered in that frozen purgatory. Could have been 20 minutes, could have been 2 hours. But then, out of the absolute blinding whiteness, a shape materialized. Darker gray against the endless white. Straight lines, sharp angles. Nature doesn't make straight lines on a mountain. I stumbled toward it, my adrenaline suddenly spiking. It was the shelter. A heavy, steeply pitched A-frame cabin built to shed massive snow loads. I practically crawled the last 30 feet, the wind fighting me every single inch. I reached the front door. It was made of thick oak, reinforced with heavy iron straps. And of course, it was frozen shut. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in my chest. No, you gotta be kidding me. I grabbed the iron handle with both of my clumsy frozen hands and yanked. Nothing. It felt welded to the frame. I let out a hoarse scream of frustration that was instantly swallowed by the wind. I lifted my heavy boot and kicked the bottom of the door with the steel spikes of my crampons. Whack! 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 Then I threw my entire body weight backward, pulling the handle with the momentum of my fall. With a loud, gunshot-like crack of breaking ice, the door finally gave way. I tumbled backward into the snow, then frantically scrambled forward on my hands and knees, dragging my heavy pack with me into the dark interior. The wind tried to follow me inside, swirling snow into the entryway, but I managed to kick the heavy wooden door shut. The iron latch clicked into place with a satisfying metallic thud. The contrast gave me psychological whiplash. Outside, it was a chaotic, deafening hellscape. Inside, it was completely dead silent. But more importantly, it was warm, unbelievably warm. I lay there, face down on the rough floorboards for a solid minute, gasping for air. The sudden shift in temperature made my skin tingle painfully. I let out a hoarse scream of frustration that was instantly swallowed by the wind. I lifted my heavy boot and kicked the bottom of the door with the steel spikes of my crampons. Whack! 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 Then I threw my entire body weight backward, pulling the handle with the momentum of my fall. With a loud, gunshot-like crack of breaking ice, the door finally gave way. I tumbled backward into the snow, then frantically scrambled forward on my hands and knees, dragging my heavy pack with me into the dark interior. The wind tried to follow me inside, swirling snow into the entryway, but I managed to kick the heavy wooden door shut. The iron latch clicked into place with a satisfying metallic thud. The contrast gave me psychological whiplash. Outside, it was a chaotic, deafening hellscape. Inside, it was completely dead silent. But more importantly, it was warm, unbelievably warm. I lay there, face down on the rough floorboards for a solid minute, gasping for air. The sudden shift in temperature made my skin tingle painfully. I smelled something amazing, pine wood burning cleanly, and beneath that, cutting through the smell of my own wet gear, the rich, earthy aroma of dark roast coffee. I pushed myself up into a sitting position. I yanked my frosted goggles off and blinked, my eyes adjusting to the dim orange light. The cabin was tiny, incredibly claustrophobic, maybe 10 by 12 feet. In the center of the far wall sat a cast iron wood-burning stove. Its metal belly was glowing a dull, angry cherry red, radiating a wave of intense heat. And sitting right next to it, in a beaten-up canvas camping chair, was a guy. I froze. My hand instinctively dropped down to the ice axe strapped to my pack. But the guy didn't look threatening at all. He looked up from the fire, completely unbothered, as if my dramatic near-death entrance was just a minor interruption. "Oh, there, brother," the man said. His voice was incredibly smooth, deep, resonant, and exceptionally calm. It had a relaxed Midwestern cadence. "Hell of an entrance. You look like you just went 10 rounds with a Yeti and lost." I just stared at him from the floor. He looked to be in his late 50s. He had a thick, neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard and wore a heavy red and black buffalo plaid flannel shirt. He looked like he just stepped out of a vintage catalog. "Come on over, man. Get by the fire before you turn into a human popsicle," he added casually, gesturing with a steaming tin mug. "I'm Ray." "Jake," I rasped out. My throat felt like dry sandpaper. I awkwardly unbuckled my frozen backpack, letting it hit the floor with a thud, and dragged my stiff body closer to the stove. I stripped off my heavy outer gloves, exposing my pale, shaking hands to the glorious heat. "Nice to meet you, Jake. Though I gotta say, you picked a truly garbage day for a hike, dude." Ray chuckled. It was a warm, genuine laugh. He picked up a battered aluminum percolator and poured a generous amount of pitch-black liquid into a spare tin mug next to him. "Here, drink up. It ain't exactly a fancy Seattle caramel macchiato, but it's hot, it's strong, and it'll thaw out your insides." I took the mug with both hands. I was shaking so violently that the coffee sloshed over the rim, burning my knuckles, but I didn't care. I took a massive gulp. It was scalding hot and bitter as hell, but it was the greatest thing I had ever tasted. I could trace the liquid heat planting a tiny glowing ember in my freezing core. "Thank you," I breathed out. I legitimately didn't think I was going to make it. I completely lost the trail. Didn't expect to find anyone else crazy enough to be up here. Ray took a slow sip from his mug, his eyes crinkling in a friendly smile. Crazy is relative, my friend. Some people think it's crazy to sit in a gray cubicle for 40 hours a week. Me? I think sometimes you just gotta get away from the noise, you know? City life grinds a man down. Up here, it's just you, the mountain, and the hard truth. And right now, admittedly, a whole lot of snow. For the next hour, I didn't think about much besides surviving and thawing out. I peeled off my frozen outer shell, watching it drip a dirty puddle onto the wooden floor. I took off my heavy boots, aggressively massaging feeling back into my purple toes. Ray was great company. He talked about old trails, geological history, legendary climbers. He used all the right climbing slang, dropped all the right gear brand names. He sounded exactly like a seasoned alpinist. But as the brutal cold retreated from my body and my brain started functioning at full capacity again, the lingering adrenaline fog began to lift. The relief started to fade, replaced by a creeping, hyper-aware clarity. And that's when the little things started poking at the edges of my perception, little glitches in reality. I looked over at Ray. He was sitting less than 2 feet from a roaring iron stove, pumping out enough BTUs to heat a small house. I was already starting to sweat. But Ray? He wasn't sweating at all. There wasn't a single bead of moisture on his forehead. In fact, looking closely at him, he looked completely pristine. My eyes drifted down to his clothes. His heavy flannel shirt, his thick canvas hiking pants, they were bone dry. I mean, they were crisp, like they just came out of a dryer. If he had been out in that monster storm, even for 60 seconds to chop wood, he would be soaked. The wind outside was driving wet, heavy snow horizontally. It permeates every fabric. But his leather boots, completely dry. Not a speck of mud or slush. There was absolutely no puddle of melted snow under his chair like the massive puddle forming under my gear. It was as if he had been beamed directly into this cabin, bypassing the storm outside entirely. A tight knot of unease began to form in my gut. Maybe he got here yesterday, I reasoned with myself. Maybe he's been inside for 24 hours. But then I looked at his gear. Resting neatly against the rough log wall was an expensive Osprey backpack. It looked brand new. The bright orange nylon was totally untouched by trail dirt. But more than that, it looked completely deflated. A guy hunkering down to survive a multi-day storm off the grid should have a pack absolutely bursting at the seams with sleeping bags, MREs, stoves, and extra layers. This bag, it hung limply against the wall. It looked entirely empty. It looked like a frickin' prop. I swallowed hard. The coffee suddenly tasted like sour ash. "Hey, Ray," I said, fighting the sharp spike of anxiety pounding against my ribs. So, how long have you been holed up in here, man? You beat the storm by a lot." Ray didn't turn his head to look at me. He just kept staring straight into the red-hot belly of the stove. The orange light flickered across his face, casting unnatural shadows in his eye sockets that made his face look suddenly gaunt. "Long enough, Jake," he said quietly. His voice had completely changed. It had lost every fraction of its folksy warmth. It was flat now, dead, monotone. Long enough to know the mountain's secrets. My heart rate kicked up a serious notch. The cabin suddenly felt suffocatingly small. It was a 10 by 12 wooden box. I was on the floor near the back wall. Ray was near the center. The heavy wooden door, the only way out, was on the exact opposite side of him. I needed to test the waters. I needed to see if my terrifying paranoia was justified. "I should probably check the weather," I said, forcing a fake hearty tone. "See if it's letting up. My buddy Brody is down at base camp. He's probably calling search and rescue. Let me just take a quick peek outside." I started to push myself up to stand. Ray moved. It wasn't a violent lunge. It was smooth, slow, and casual. He reached out with his right hand to grab a thick log, but as he did, he shifted his entire body weight, sliding his canvas chair a few inches to the left. At the same time, he stretched his long legs out, crossing his perfectly dry boots right in front of the stove. It looked natural on the surface, but the positioning was surgically precise. That subtle movement completely bottlenecked the only walkable path to the door. To reach the handle, I would literally have to climb directly over his legs. He had blocked the exit. He tossed the log into the fire. Sparks flew out of the open door, hissing loudly as they hit the damp floorboards near my feet. "Oh, I really wouldn't do that, brother," Ray said. He turned his head slowly to look at me. The friendly twinkle in his eyes was gone. His eyes were cold, flat, dark, and completely unreadable. "It's an absolute monster out there. You step out that door right now, you're not coming back. Trust me." A heavy silence fell over the tiny room, broken only by the shrieking wind battering the roof and the sharp crackle of the flames. He didn't blink. He just stared at me. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be, Jake," he whispered, a slow, incredibly unnatural smile spreading across his face, not reaching his dead eyes. "Why don't you sit back down? We have all the time in the world." And right then, looking into the perfectly dry face of a man with absolutely zero survival gear in the middle of a deadly blizzard, the terrifying, ice-cold realization finally hit me. This guy wasn't a stranded climber. He wasn't a fellow hiker waiting out the storm. He lived here. He waited here. And like an absolute trusting idiot, I had just locked myself inside his cage. I sat back down, slowly, carefully, like I was lowering my weight onto a live landmine. My knees hit the rough, splintery floorboards with a dull thud that felt way too loud in the sudden, heavy silence of the cabin. The adrenaline that had just begun to recede from my system came roaring back like a freight train, completely different this time. Before, it was the primal, blind panic of freezing to death. Now it was the sharp, hyper-focused terror of being hunted. "Good choice," Ray murmured. His voice was back to that smooth, Midwestern butter. He didn't gloat. He didn't laugh like some cartoon villain. He just gave a small, approving nod, grabbed the rusted iron poker resting next to the stove, and casually stirred the glowing embers. "The mountain is a harsh mistress, Jake," he continued, not looking at me. "She doesn't care about your Gore-Tex or your GPS trackers. She just takes. You gotta respect her, and you gotta know when to just stay put." I swallowed the lump of sandpaper in my throat. I tried to mentally catalog my assets, running a desperate inventory check in my head. My legs were still basically useless, twitching with the painful burn of thawing nerves. My heavy boots were off. My outer shell was hanging on a nail 3 feet away. The only weapon I had was the black diamond ice axe strapped to my pack. The pack was currently sitting right next to my left hip. It was close, but the axe was secured with 2 thick nylon buckle straps. It would take me at least 5 to 10 seconds to unclip it and pull it free. 10 seconds. In a space this tight, 10 seconds is a lifetime. Ray could close the distance and be on top of me in 2. "Yeah," I forced myself to say. I aimed for a casual, exhausted tone, but my voice cracked, betraying me. "Yeah, man, you're probably right. Let the storm blow over." Ray turned his head, locking those dead black stone eyes onto mine again. The complete lack of emotion in them was profoundly disturbing. It was like looking into the eyes of a great white shark just before it bites down. "So," Ray said, leaning back in his canvas chair, completely ignoring the fact that he was intentionally barricading the only exit. "Tell me about this buddy of yours. Brody, was it?" The casual interrogation had begun. The classic predator move. He was feeling out my perimeter, trying to figure out exactly how isolated I was and who was going to come looking for me. "Brody." "Yeah," I lied, keeping my eyes on the steaming tin mug in my hands, afraid he would see the gears turning in my head. "He's a beast. He's ex-military, actually, Army Ranger. We were supposed to summit together, but he had a slight ankle tweak. He's waiting for me down at the secondary base camp. the one just off the ranger station. I was throwing out buzzwords, hoping to make myself sound like more trouble than I was worth. He's a ranger. He's at a populated camp. People are expecting me. Ray let out a low, slow whistle. An army ranger, huh? Sounds like a tough guy. But even tough guys get tired of waiting, especially in a whiteout. You think he's really gonna sit on his thumbs in a freezing tent while this system dumps 3 feet of snow on the pass? He's got a satellite phone, I pushed back, tightening my grip on the mug. If I don't check in by 1800 hours, he's calling the cavalry, search and rescue, the whole 9 yards. Ray didn't blink. He just stared at me, a tiny patronizing smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He knew I was full of bullshit. He could smell the desperation radiating off me like cheap cologne. "That's reassuring," Ray said softly. He reached down to the floor on his right side, rummaging around near the stack of chopped firewood. "It's always good to have a backup plan, a safety net." When he sat back up, my breath caught in my throat. In his large, dry hand, he held a knife. It wasn't a standard folding pocket knife you'd use to cut parachute cord or open a freeze-dried meal. It was a massive, fixed-blade hunting knife, the kind with a thick 6-inch carbon steel blade and a heavy bone handle. The metal caught the orange light of the fire, gleaming with a dark, oily sheen. He didn't point it at me. He didn't make any aggressive moves. He just pulled a block of hard white cheddar cheese from his shirt pocket, placed it on his knee, and slowly, methodically began to carve thick slices off it. Slice. The blade bit through the cheese with terrifying ease. Slice. He popped a piece into his mouth, chewing thoughtfully. "Want some?" he offered, holding out the tip of the massive blade toward me, a piece of cheese impaled on the end. "I'm good, thanks," I stammered, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. My stomach is a little tied up from the cold. "Suit yourself," Ray said, sliding the cheese off the blade with his thumb and eating it himself. "You gotta keep your strength up, though. The body burns a hell of a lot of fuel when it's under extreme stress. And you, Jake, you look very stressed." He was playing with me, a sick, twisted game of cat and mouse. He was enjoying the power dynamic, watching me squirm in this tiny wooden box. I realized then that panicking wasn't going to save me. I needed to think clearly. I needed to look past his gaslighting and actually observe my environment. While Ray continued to slowly whittle away at the block of cheese, I let my eyes drift around the dimly lit cabin. The place was a dump. It was a standard-issue emergency shelter, built purely for survival, not comfort. The walls were rough-hewn logs, chinked with dry moss and some kind of hardening putty. The ceiling was low, but as my eyes adjusted to the flickering shadows, I started to notice things that absolutely did not belong in an emergency shelter. Above Ray's head, hanging from a rusty nail driven into the main crossbeam, was a collection of headlamps. 3 of them. They were all different brands, a Petzl, a Black Diamond, and a cheap generic one. They were strung together by their elastic bands like a bizarre, macabre wind chime. Why would one guy need 3 different headlamps? My eyes tracked lower, moving along the wooden shelves built into the back corner. Among the scattered tins of beans and rusty tools, I saw a pair of high-end Oakley polarized sunglasses. The lenses were badly scratched and the frame was slightly bent. Right next to them sat a bright pink Nalgene water bottle covered in faded stickers. A pink water bottle. Ray was a burly, bearded guy living off the grid. He didn't strike me as the sticker-covered pink Nalgene type. Then, the final horrifying puzzle piece clicked into place. My gaze dropped to the pile of chopped firewood near the stove. Sticking out from under a particularly heavy log was a piece of fabric. Ray had clearly been using it as a rag to wipe down his tools or the stove. It was dirty and soot-stained, but the original color was unmistakable. It was a vibrant teal-blue fleece. My stomach plummeted. The room started to spin. 2 weeks ago, before Brody and I even packed the truck for this trip, I was standing at the main ranger station down in the valley, filling out our backcountry permits. Pinned to the corkboard right next to the registration window was a missing person flyer. I had stared at it while waiting in line. Missing, Sarah Wilkins, 24 years old, last seen on the Upper Ridge Trail, wearing a bright teal Patagonia fleece pullover. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, completely negating the roasting heat of the iron stove. The empty, deflated backpack, the pristine, dry clothes, the collection of random gear, the teal rag. This wasn't just a squatter. This cabin was a spider web, and Ray was the spider. He just sat here, deep off the main trails, waiting for extreme weather to drive desperate, freezing hikers right to his doorstep. He didn't have to hunt them. The mountain delivered them directly to him, practically gift-wrapped, exhausted, and completely defenseless. "You're awfully quiet over there, Jake," Ray said, breaking through my spiraling thoughts. He had stopped slicing the cheese. He was holding the hunting knife loosely in his lap, the point resting against his thigh. "You look pale. You sure you don't want any food? I've got a stew going. Should be ready any minute." He pointed with his chin toward the flat top of the cast iron stove. Sitting on the back edge, bubbling softly, was a large, heavy Dutch oven. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The smell of the cabin, the pine and the coffee, suddenly felt sickeningly sweet. "Really, I'm okay." "Nonsense," Ray said, finally putting the knife down on the wooden crate beside him. He shifted his weight, preparing to stand up. "You're a guest in my home. It's only right I show you some proper hospitality." As he stood, his sheer physical size became immediately apparent. Sitting down, he looked like an average older guy. Standing up in the cramped confines of the A-frame, he was a massive, hulking figure. He had to stoop slightly to avoid hitting his head on the slanted ceiling. He completely dominated the space, a physical wall between me and any hope of escape. He turned his back to me for exactly 3 seconds to reach for a pair of thick leather welding gloves resting on a shelf near the stove. 3 seconds. It was the only window I was going to get. Driven by pure, unfiltered survival instinct, my right hand shot out. I didn't go for my pack. I didn't go for the buckles on the ice axe. It would take too long. Instead, my fingers closed around the handle of the rusted iron fire poker, resting on the floorboards, just inches from my knee. The metal was warm and heavy. I didn't lift it. I just gripped it tightly, pulling it slightly closer to my body, hiding it against the side of my leg. Ray turned back around, the heavy leather gloves now covering his hands. He reached out and grabbed the iron handle of the Dutch oven, pulling it toward the front of the stove. "You know," Ray said, his back still partially turned as he lifted the heavy lid of the pot, letting a thick cloud of steam billow up to the ceiling. "Most people who come through that door, they're screaming, crying, begging for help. They're so panicked by the storm they don't even look around. They don't even see the reality of the situation until it's far, far too late." He slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder at me. His eyes dropped down to my right hand. He saw the way my knuckles were white. He saw the iron poker clutched against my leg. A slow, terrifying grin stretched across his face, exposing his teeth. "But you," Ray whispered, his voice vibrating with a sick, excited energy. "You're a smart one, Jake. You see it. I like that. It makes the game a whole lot more fun." The smile on Ray's face didn't belong to a human being. It was the mechanical, dead-eyed rictus of a predator that just realized its prey was going to put up a fight. It didn't deter him. It energized him. The heavy, stifling silence in the cabin stretched for a fraction of a second, pulled so tight I thought my eardrums would snap. Then the tension shattered. Ray didn't bother setting the heavy cast iron lid back on the Dutch oven. He just dropped it. It hit the wooden floorboards with a deafening metallic clang that made my heart jump into my throat. The thick, savory smell of the boiling stew suddenly felt nauseating, mixing with the sharp copper tang of fear radiating off my own sweat. "You think that rusty piece of junk is gonna save you, kid?" Ray chuckled, a low, guttural sound that rattled in his chest. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, He still had the heavy leather welding gloves on his hands. He raised them up, flexing his thick fingers. "I've been out here a long time, Jake. You're not the first hiker to try and play hero. You won't be the last." My brain went into absolute overdrive. The primal lizard part of my mind took the wheel, fight or flight. But there was no flight. The door was behind him, and even if I somehow teleported through it, I was currently sitting in my damp wool socks, my boots off, with a Category 5 blizzard raging outside. I had to fight. I had to go completely feral. "Stay back!" I screamed, my voice cracking, sounding weak and pathetic even to my own ears. I scrambled to my feet, my legs burning with the agonizing pins and needles of thawing nerves. I gripped the heavy iron fire poker with both hands like a baseball bat, holding it out in front of me. Ray didn't even flinch. He lunged. For a big, older guy, he moved with terrifying, explosive speed. I swung the poker with every ounce of strength I had in my shoulders, aiming straight for his head. I wanted to crack his skull open. I wanted to end it right there. But I was exhausted, my muscles still sluggish from the hypothermia. Ray ducked his chin, taking the brutal impact on his left shoulder. Crack! The iron hit his thick buffalo flannel with a sickening thud. I felt the vibration travel straight up my arms, jarring my teeth. I definitely broke something in his shoulder, but it didn't even slow his momentum. Before I could pull the poker back for a second swing, he closed the gap. He slammed into me like a runaway freight train. The sheer physical weight of him was overwhelming. I was thrown backward, my boots and gear tangling around my ankles. We crashed onto the hard, splintery floorboards. All the breath exploded out of my lungs in a violent whoosh. Ray was on top of me instantly, his heavy knee pinning my thigh to the ground. The smell of him was overpowering up close. Wood smoke, stale sweat, and something older, metallic, and distinctly foul. He reached down and grabbed the collar of my Arc'teryx base layer with his thick, leather-gloved hands, yanking me halfway off the floor. I thrashed wildly, bucking my hips, trying to dislodge him, but it was like trying to wrestle a silverback gorilla. He had that insane, wiry old man strength, amplified by pure malice. "You should have just taken the food, Jake," he roared, spit flying from his lips and hitting my cheek. "It's so much easier when you just go to sleep." He drove his right fist into my ribs. Bam! The pain was blinding, a sharp, white-hot flash that took away my vision for a split second. I gasped, tasting blood in the back of my throat. He pulled his arm back for another strike, aiming for my face this time. I let go of the poker, it was useless at this range, and brought both my hands up, desperately grabbing his thick wrist. I dug my thumbs into the nerves, kicking my legs wildly, trying to find any leverage. My right heel slammed into something solid, the wooden crate next to his canvas chair. My eyes darted to the side. Resting on top of that crate, gleaming in the firelight, was the massive bone-handled hunting knife he had been using to slice the cheese. Ray saw where I was looking. He immediately let go of my collar and lunged for the knife. I didn't try to beat him to it. I knew I couldn't. Instead, I used his own momentum against him. As he leaned off me to grab the weapon, I planted my left foot squarely on his chest and shoved upward with everything I had. He lost his balance, tumbling backward off me. He crashed into the stack of chopped firewood, sending logs clattering all over the tiny cabin. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving, sucking in desperate gulps of the hot, pine-scented air. I didn't go for the door. Without my boots, the storm outside was just a slower, colder death. I needed my gear. I dove toward the corner where I had dropped my backpack. Ray was already recovering. He shook his head, letting out a roar of pure rage, and pushed himself up. He had the hunting knife in his hand now. The blade looked a foot long in the claustrophobic space. "I'm gonna gut you like a fricking trout, you little punk," he screamed, all traces of his calm, folksy persona completely annihilated. He charged me again, the knife raised high. I had no time to unbuckle the ice axe from my pack. I was backed into the corner, directly next to the roaring cast-iron stove. The heat coming off the metal was blistering, practically singeing the hair on my arms. I needed a weapon now. My hand frantically patted the surface of the stove. My fingers grazed the scalding hot metal of the battered aluminum coffee percolator. Ray swung the knife down in a vicious arc, aiming straight for my collarbone. I didn't think. I just reacted. I grabbed the handle of the percolator. It burned my palm instantly, raising a blister through my thin gloves, and ripped it off the stove. In one fluid, desperate motion, I swung it like a mace directly into Ray's face. The aluminum shattered against his cheekbone. But more importantly, the entire contents of the pot, nearly a quart of boiling, sludgy, pitch-black coffee, exploded across his eyes and neck. Ray let out a sound I will never, ever forget. It wasn't a human scream. It was the high-pitched, shrieking squeal of an animal being boiled alive. He dropped the hunting knife, his hands flying up to claw at his own face. The boiling liquid soaked into his thick beard, holding the agonizing heat directly against his skin. He stumbled backward, thrashing blindly, knocking over the canvas camping chair and slamming into the back wall of the cabin. This was it, the only window I was ever going to get. I ignored the searing pain in my own burned hand. I lunged forward, grabbing my heavy leather mountaineering boots from the floor. I didn't have time to lace them up. I just shoved my numb, wool-socked feet into the stiff boots, stomping my heels down to force them in. They were incredibly loose, flopping around my ankles, but they were better than nothing. I grabbed my backpack by the top haul loop. I couldn't put it on. It would slow me down too much, but my survival depended on the gear inside it. I dragged it across the floor toward the heavy oak door. Ray was still screaming, down on his knees now, rubbing his face into his flannel shirt, trying to wipe the scalding liquid from his eyes. Large red blisters were already forming on his forehead and cheeks. I reached the door. I grabbed the heavy iron latch with my uninjured hand and yanked it upward. It was stiff. The ice from the storm outside had already started to freeze the mechanism shut again. "Come on, come on, come on!" I panicked, rattling the latch violently. Suddenly, the screaming behind me stopped. I glanced over my shoulder. Ray was on his feet. His face was a horrific mess of angry red burns and dripping coffee grounds. His left eye was swollen completely shut, but his right eye was wide open, bloodshot, and locked onto me with a hatred so pure it made me care feel heavy. He saw me at the door. He didn't say a word. He just lowered his head and charged, a massive, silent, unstoppable force. I threw my entire body weight backward against the iron handle. With a deafening crack, the ice gave way. The heavy oak door swung open, pulling me out with it. The storm didn't just greet me, it assaulted me. The transition from the roasting heat of the cabin to the sub-zero hurricane outside was like being thrown into a wood chipper made of ice. The wind hit me so hard, it literally knocked the breath out of my lungs, blowing a massive swirl of snow directly into the cabin. I stumbled out onto the small, snow-covered porch, dragging my heavy back behind me. I turned to slam the door shut, hoping to trap him inside, but Ray was too fast. Just as I grabbed the outside edge of the door, a massive, leather-gloved hand shot out from the darkness of the cabin. His fingers wrapped around the loose collar of my unlaced right boot with a crushing grip. He yanked backward. My feet flew out from under me. I hit the icy planks of the porch hard, my chin bouncing off the wood. The wind howled, burying my scream. Ray was pulling me back inside. I could see his burned, enraged face appearing in the doorway, the orange glow of the fire behind him casting him in a demonic silhouette. He was using both hands now, dragging my leg toward the cabin, dragging me back into the tiny wooden slaughterhouse. "You're not going anywhere," he bellowed over the roaring wind. I was sliding backward across the ice. I was losing. My right hand, still gripping my backpack, fumbled desperately for the side straps. My frozen, blistered fingers found the thick nylon buckles holding my ice axe in place. I squeezed the plastic clips. Snap! The first one gave way. I was almost completely back inside the doorway. Ray shifted his grip, letting go of my boot to grab my actual ankle, his fingers digging painfully into my Achilles tendon. He was going to pull me in and shut the door. I squeezed the second buckle. Snap! I ripped the black diamond ice axe free from the pack. The heavy spiel head gleamed in the dim light. I didn't think about the morality of it. I didn't think about anything except the pure, burning desire to survive. I flipped onto my back, looking up at the massive man towering over me in the doorway. I gripped the shaft of the axe with both hands, raised it up, and brought the serrated steel pick down as hard as I possibly could, aiming straight for the thick, gloved forearm that was holding my leg hostage. The steel pick of the black diamond ice axe didn't just hit his arm, it sank in with a sickening, meaty thwack. I felt the brutal vibration travel up the aluminum shaft and directly into my burned palms. The serrated blade tore through the thick leather of his welding glove, sliced cleanly through the heavy buffalo flannel, and bit deep into the muscle and bone of his forearm. Most people would have screamed. They would have dropped to their knees, clutching the wound, incapacitated by the sheer shock of cold steel wedged into their flesh. But Ray wasn't most people. He wasn't a stranded hiker, and at that moment, I wasn't even entirely convinced he was human. He didn't scream. He let out a wet, guttural grunt, like a massive, wounded bear, and his hand convulsively snapped open. The crushing grip on my ankle vanished. I didn't hesitate for a microsecond. I didn't try to pull the axe free. I just let go of the handle, leaving it jutting out of his arm, and pushed myself backward with both feet. I slid off the icy, blood-slicked edge of the porch and plunged backward into the waist-deep snowdrift surrounding the cabin. I hit the powder hard, completely engulfed in the freezing white void. Above me, on the porch, Ray let out a roar of absolute, unhinged fury that somehow managed to drown out the shrieking wind. I saw his massive silhouette framed in the doorway, backlit by the orange, mocking glow of the wood stove. He reached over with his right hand, gripped the shaft of my ice axe, and with one violent, horrifyingly casual yank, ripped it out of his own arm. Blood, black in the dim light, sprayed across the wooden planks. He threw the bloody axe into the snow and stepped forward to come after me. But the mountain had other plans. The wind caught the heavy oak door of the cabin. With a sound like a cannon shot, a massive gale-force gust caught the broad side of the wood and slammed it shut behind him. The heavy iron latch clicked into place. The sudden absence of the cabin's light plunged the world into an absolute, suffocating darkness. It was just me, Ray, and a Category 5 blizzard. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, frantically trying to put distance between us. I grabbed my backpack by the top loop and dragged it with me, plowing a massive, clumsy trench through the fresh powder. Every instinct screamed at me to just stand up and sprint, but you don't sprint in 3 feet of snow. You flounder, you drown. "Jake," Ray's voice bellowed through the whiteout. It didn't sound folksy anymore. It sounded demonic, distorted by the howling wind. "You're dead out here, kid. You hear me? You are already a dead man." He wasn't entirely wrong. My situation was catastrophically bad. When I made my desperate, adrenaline-fueled escape, I had left my $800 Arc'teryx Gore-Tex hardshell hanging on a rusty nail inside that roasting cabin. I was currently taking on a lethal Pacific Northwest blizzard, wearing nothing but sweat-soaked merino wool base layers and tactical summit pants. The wind cut through the wool like it was made of cheap toilet paper. The moisture on my skin from sweating inside the cabin instantly flash froze, turning my base layers into an icy, suffocating straitjacket. And my boots, oh God, my boots. I had violently jammed my feet into them, but they were completely unlaced. With every frantic backward scramble through the drifts, the heavy leather boots threatened to get sucked off my feet and lost in the snow forever. If I lost a boot out here, I wouldn't last 20 minutes. My toes would blacken and die before I even realized they were gone. I needed to stop. I needed to gear up. But stopping meant letting him catch me. I kept crawling, moving blindly away from where I thought the cabin was. The visibility was literally zero. I couldn't see my own hand if I stretched it out in front of my face. The snow wasn't just falling, it was being driven horizontally by 50-mile-per-hour gusts, acting like a million tiny sandblasters hitting my exposed face. I bumped into something solid, hard, jagged rock, a massive granite boulder jutting out of the mountainside. I dragged myself around to the leeward side of it, collapsing into the small, temporary pocket of calm air it provided. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled to a dull, heavy thrum. I had to work fast. The adrenaline crash was coming, and when it hit, my body was going to realize it was freezing to death. My hands were practically useless. My right palm was covered in angry, agonizing blisters from grabbing the boiling percolator, and my fingers on both hands were rapidly losing all sensation to the cold. I fumbled with the thick laces of my heavy mountaineering boots. It felt like I was trying to thread a needle while wearing boxing gloves. I cursed violently, tears of frustration freezing to my eyelashes as I fought the stiff, icy laces. I finally managed to yank them tight enough to stay on, wrapping the excess cord around my ankles and tying a sloppy, desperate double knot. Next, the pack. I shoved my arms through the shoulder straps and yanked the waist belt tight, buckling it with a sharp click. The heavy weight of the pack actually felt good. It was a familiar pressure against my back, a tiny piece of my normal life in this absolute nightmare. I reached around to the side of the pack, feeling for my secondary tools. My ice axe was gone, left bleeding in the snow on Ray's porch, but I had my trekking poles. They were collapsible, made of lightweight carbon fiber with sharp carbide tips. They weren't a great weapon against a giant with a 6-inch hunting knife, but they were better than my bare, blistered hands. I unclipped one and snapped it to its full extension, gripping the cork handle tightly. I pressed my back against the freezing granite of the boulder, trying to slow my ragged breathing. I strained my ears, trying to listen past the deafening howl of the storm. Nothing. Just the relentless, shrieking wind. Was he still looking for me? Or had he gone back inside to tend to his arm and wait for the storm to finish the job? If he went back inside, he had the high ground. He had warmth, food, and my Gore-Tex jacket. I was out here, a walking popsicle with a ticking clock. Hypothermia wasn't just knocking at the door anymore. It had kicked the damn hinges off and was making itself comfortable in my chest. I started violently shivering again. My teeth clattered together so hard my jaw ached. I couldn't stay here behind the boulder. If I stopped moving, I would freeze solid. I needed a better shelter, a natural snow cave, a deep crevasse, anything to get me out of this meat grinder. I peeked around the edge of the rock. The whiteout was still absolute. Stepping out of this small pocket of safety felt like stepping out of an airlock into deep space. But I had no choice. I pushed off the boulder, leaning heavily into the wind, using the trekking pole to probe the deep snow in front of me so I didn't walk right off a sheer cliff. I moved blindly, completely disoriented, relying on pure, dumb luck. Every step was agonizing. The snow was thigh-deep, acting like wet cement pulling at my legs. My lungs burned with the icy air. My burned hand throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that timed perfectly with my racing heartbeat. I don't know how far I walked. Maybe 100 yards, maybe a mile. Time and distance don't exist in a whiteout. But then the terrain shifted. The ground sloped sharply downward, and the driving wind suddenly broke, blocked by something massive. Trees. I had stumbled into a patch of old-growth Douglas firs. These monsters were easily 100 feet tall, their massive, drooping branches catching the brunt of the snowfall and creating a dense canopy. The snow under them was significantly shallower, and the wind was just a whisper compared to the absolute hellscape above. I collapsed against the thick, rough bark of the nearest trunk, sliding down until I hit the ground. I was completely spent. My tank was on absolute zero. I looked down at the base of the massive tree, because the lower branches act like an umbrella, preventing snow from packing directly against the trunk. They create something called a tree well, a deep, hidden cavity of loose, unconsolidated snow around the base. They are incredibly dangerous. Skiers fall into them headfirst all the time and suffocate. But right now, That dangerous hole looked like a five-star hotel. I carefully lowered myself into the depression, burrowing down into the loose powder right up against the massive root system of the tree. The branches above me formed a natural roof. It was dark, claustrophobic, and freezing, but it completely cut off the wind chill. For a guy in a wet base layer, it was the difference between living another hour and dying in 10 minutes. I curled into a tight, miserable ball, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to conserve whatever microscopic amount of body heat I had left. I closed my eyes. The sheer, overwhelming exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on my eyelids. The urge to just drift off, to let the cold take me, was intoxicatingly strong. "Just a 5-minute nap, Jake," my brain whispered seductively. "You earned it. Just close your eyes." "No," I croaked out loud, my voice sounding incredibly frail. I dug the sharp carbide tip of my trekking pole into my own thigh, letting the sharp spike of pain jolt me awake. Stay awake. Stay in the game. I sat there in the dark, shivering violently, waiting for dawn, waiting for a miracle. And then I heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a sound that didn't belong in nature. A heavy, rhythmic, crunching sound. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Pause. Footsteps. Deep, heavy boots breaking through the icy crust of the snow. My blood ran completely cold. The shivering stopped instantly, replaced by a rigid, paralyzing terror. He didn't go back inside. The crazy bastard was actually out here. He was hunting me in a Category 5 blizzard. The footsteps were getting louder. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They were incredibly close. He had somehow tracked me through the whiteout. Maybe he followed the massive trench I dug in the snow before the wind could fill it in. Maybe he had done this so many times he just knew the natural lay of the land, knew exactly where a desperate, freezing animal would go to hide. I held my breath, pressing my back harder into the tree trunk, trying to melt into the bark. I gripped the trekking pole so tightly my knuckles popped. The footsteps stopped. He was standing right above my tree well. If I looked up, I knew I would see the tips of his dry leather boots protruding over the edge of the snowpack. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. It stretched for an eternity. He was standing completely still, listening, searching for the sound of my chattering teeth or my ragged breathing. Then a voice floated down into the darkness. It was incredibly soft, almost conversational, perfectly cutting through the muffled sound of the storm above. "I know you're in there, Jake," Ray whispered, the sound dripping with a sickening predatory amusement. "I can smell the fear on you, and to be honest, it smells delicious." He shifted his weight above me. A small cascade of loose snow tumbled over the edge, raining down onto my face. "I brought your jacket," he added casually, his voice hovering right above my hiding spot. "You look so cold down there." "Why don't you come on up, and we'll get you warmed up properly?" I squeezed my eyes shut, raising the sharp tip of the trekking pole toward the opening above me. I was trapped in a hole, freezing to death with a monster standing at the door. There was nowhere left to run. I was a cornered rat in a freezing hole, and the exterminator was standing right above me. "Come on, Jake," Ray coaxed, his voice dripping with that sick, artificial Midwestern warmth. The snow continued to dust my face as he shifted his weight on the edge of the tree well. "Don't make me come down there. It's tight. It'll get messy. Just hand up the pole, take my hand, and we'll go back inside. I'll even pour you a fresh cup of coffee." He chuckled. A low, wet, rattling sound. He was mocking me. He knew exactly what he had done to my face with that boiling sludge, and he was reveling in it. I didn't say a word. I just tightened my grip on the cork handle of the carbon fiber trekking pole, aiming the sharp carbide tip directly upward. My breathing was ragged, shallow little gasps that burned my lungs. My muscles were locking up from the extreme cold. I knew I had maybe 30 seconds of usable explosive energy left in my body before the hypothermia completely paralyzed me. Suddenly, a massive dark shape blocked out the pale ambient light of the storm above. Ray wasn't waiting anymore. He was coming down. He slid feet first over the edge of the packed snow, his heavy boots crashing down into the loose powder of the well. The confined space instantly shrank to nothing. He was huge, filling the hole, blotting out the sky. As he dropped, he reached out blindly with his uninjured right hand, the one holding the massive bone-handled hunting knife, ready to pin me down and finish the job. I didn't hesitate. This was my Hail Mary. As his boots hit the dirt right next to my hip, I thrust the trekking pole upward with every miserable ounce of strength I had left in my shivering shoulders. I didn't aim for his torso. He had too many thick layers on. I aimed high. The sharp carbide tip caught him right under the chin, sliding past his thick, coffee-soaked beard and digging deep into the soft, fleshy meat of his throat. Ray let out a gargled, choking shriek. The impact wasn't lethal. The pole was too blunt to sever an artery cleanly, but the sheer, shocking agony of it made his body completely recoil. His head snapped backward, and he dropped the hunting knife into the snow beside me. His hands flew up to his neck, clutching the shaft of the pole. This was it, the absolute final window. I didn't try to pull the pole back. I let go of it, planted my frozen boots on his chest, and kicked upward like I was leg-pressing a truck. The force sent Ray staggering backward against the steep, snowy wall of the well. He lost his footing, his heavy boots slipping on the loose powder. I scrambled. I clawed my way up the opposite side of the hole like a feral animal, my numb, bleeding fingers digging into the icy crust, my boots kicking frantically. I crested the lip of the tree well and rolled out into the howling, horizontal blizzard. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I frantically crawled forward through the deep snow, trying to get away from the hole. My hands brushed against something slick and synthetic. My Gore-Tex jacket. He hadn't been lying. He had actually brought it out to taunt me. I snatched the bright blue fabric from the snow, desperately shoving my arms through the frozen sleeves and yanking the zipper up to my chin. The wind-blocking effect was instantaneous. It was like someone had suddenly shut a freezer door. It wasn't warm, but it stopped the wind from actively stripping the life out of me. Behind me, a terrifying roar erupted from the tree well. Ray exploded out of the hole. He looked like an actual demon ripped straight out of a nightmare. The trekking pole had fallen away, but his neck was a bloody mess. Half of his face was an angry, blistered canvas of severe burns, his left eye swollen completely shut. His right arm, where I had buried the ice axe, hung uselessly at his side, the sleeve of his buffalo flannel soaked black with his own blood. He was running on pure psychotic adrenaline, a massive, wounded grizzly bear looking for a kill. He locked his one good eye on me and charged. I scrambled to my feet, backing away into the dense cluster of Douglas firs. The snow here was still waist-deep, making every step an exhausting, slow-motion nightmare. "I'm gonna rip your freaking head off!" he screamed, his voice bubbling with blood. He lunged forward, closing the distance terrifyingly fast despite his injuries. I tried to pivot behind a massive tree trunk, but my unlaced, sloppy boot caught on a hidden root beneath the snow. I pitched backward, falling flat on my back into the powder. Ray was on top of me in a second. He didn't have the knife anymore, but he didn't need it. He dropped his massive weight onto my chest, knocking the remaining air from my lungs. His good hand, the one in the thick welding glove, clamped down onto my throat. His grip was mechanical, absolute. I immediately started seeing black spots swimming in my vision. The roaring wind faded, replaced by the high-pitched, terrifying squeal of my own blood rushing in my ears. I thrashed wildly, bucking my hips, clawing at his face, but he just leaned in closer, his one crazed eye wide and staring. "Night, night, Jake," he whispered, spitting blood onto my cheek. I was dying. I could feel my brain shutting down, the darkness closing in from the edges. My hands dropped from his face, thrashing weakly against his sides. My right hand, raw and blistered, brushed against his left arm, the arm I had hit with the ice axe. My fingers felt the thick, sticky wetness of the blood. I felt the deep, gaping tear in his heavy flannel shirt. I felt the torn meat underneath. I didn't think. It was pure survival instinct. I shoved my entire right hand directly into the open wound, digging my blistered fingers as deeply into the severed muscle and torn nerves as I physically could. I squeezed and twisted. Ray let out a scream that didn't sound human. It was a supersonic shriek of absolute mind-shattering agony. His grip on my throat vanished instantly. He threw his body backward, rolling off me and collapsing into the snow, clutching his mutilated arm to his chest, convulsing violently. I rolled onto my side, gasping, sucking in massive, greedy lungfuls of the freezing air. I coughed violently, my throat burning like fire. Ray was thrashing in the snow, entirely consumed by the pain. He rolled over, blindly trying to get to his feet. He staggered backward, completely disoriented, his one eye rolling wildly in its socket. He didn't realize where he was. He didn't realize he was backing up toward the edge of the tree line. "Ray!" I croaked out, pushing myself up onto my knees. He snapped his head toward me, a mask of pure, murderous hatred. He took one massive, aggressive step backward to brace himself for another charge, but there was no ground there. The patch of old-growth trees bordered a steep, sudden drop-off, a massive, rocky ravine hidden completely by the blowing snow and the darkness. His heavy boot hit empty air. The look on his face shifted instantly from murderous rage to stark, absolute terror. For one suspended second, he just hovered there, his arms windmilling desperately, trying to grab onto a reality that was no longer there. Then, he dropped. He fell backward into the white void. He didn't scream on the way down. He just vanished, swallowed whole by the howling belly of the storm. A few seconds later, I heard a dull, distant thud over the roar of the wind, followed by the sickening sound of tumbling rocks and snapping branches. Then, nothing. Just the blizzard. I stayed on my knees for a long time, staring into the empty white space where he had just been. My brain couldn't process it. The threat was gone. The monster was dead. But the mountain wasn't done with me yet. The adrenaline crashed, and when it did, it took my legs with it. I collapsed face first into the snow. The cold was absolute. I was wearing my jacket now, but I was still soaked in sweat, freezing and utterly exhausted. If I stayed here, I would die, just as surely as if Ray had choked me out. I had to do the one thing my mind was screaming at me not to do. I had to go back to the cabin. I dragged myself up. I found my backpack half buried near the tree well. I slung it over one shoulder and began the agonizing, pathetic trudge back up the slope, following the deep, clumsy trench we had carved during the chase. Every step was a battle against my own failing body. My vision kept narrowing, threatening to black out completely. I just kept my eyes on the snow directly in front of my boots, placing one foot in front of the other. One more step. One more step. When the dark, jagged shape of the A-frame shelter finally materialized out of the whiteout, I actually started crying. The tears froze on my cheeks instantly. The heavy oak door was still blown shut. I practically collapsed against it, grabbing the iron latch with both hands and throwing my weight backwards. It opened. I fell inside, tumbling onto the rough floorboards. I kicked the door shut behind me, reaching up and slamming the heavy iron deadbolt into place. I locked myself inside the serial killer's cage, but it was warm. God, it was warm. The cast iron stove was still roaring, the heavy logs Ray had added keeping it glowing cherry red. The cabin still smelled like pine, spilled coffee, and blood. I stripped off my frozen boots and wet base layers, wrapping myself in the thick, dry wool blankets I found stashed in Ray's immaculate Osprey pack. I huddled in the corner, as far away from the door as possible, clutching the rusted fire poker in my burned hands. I sat there all night. I didn't sleep. Every time the wind slammed against the heavy oak door, I flinched, expecting to see a bloody, burned face peering through the frost. I stared at the pink, sticker-covered Nalgene bottle on the shelf until the sun came up. Morning broke with a blinding, mocking clarity. The storm had completely blown itself out overnight, leaving behind a pristine, silent world of glittering, untouched white. The sunlight streaming through the tiny frosted window of the cabin was painfully bright. Around 10 a.m., I heard the most beautiful sound in the history of the world, the rhythmic, heavy thwup, thwup, thwup of chopper blades. Brody had called the cavalry. I didn't have the strength to walk. I managed to pry the heavy door open and drag myself out onto the sunny porch, waving my bright orange backpack weakly in the air. The rescue helicopter spotted me instantly, hovering like a giant, noisy metal angel over the tree line before dropping a winch. When the rescue jumper touched down on the snow and ran over to me, wrapping a massive thermal blanket around my shoulders, I finally let go of the fire poker. It clattered against the wooden planks. "We got you, man. You're safe," the rescue tech yelled over the roar of the rotors, looking at my bruised throat and blistered hands with wide eyes. "What the hell happened up here? Did you fall?" I didn't answer him right away. I looked past him toward the dense patch of Douglas firs bordering the hidden ravine. The pristine, glittering snow covered everything, hiding the violence, hiding the blood, hiding the monster that lived on the mountain. "Yeah," I rasped, my voice barely a whisper, sounding hollow and completely broken. "I fell. But I think you guys need to search the ravine down there. You're gonna need a lot of body bags." The tech gave me a confused, deeply unsettled look before signaling the chopper to hoist us up. As we lifted off, pulling away from the brutal, majestic face of the mountain, I looked down at the tiny A-frame cabin one last time. It looked so peaceful from up there, just a quiet, rustic little shelter in the snow. A place where a freezing hiker might knock on the door, hoping for a little warm hospitality.